What happens when a city becomes too important to lose, but too expensive to truly save? A place built to project power is now discovering what it feels like to live inside a shrinking cage. If you want more deep stories that turn maps into human drama, tap like, subscribe, and send this video to one friend who loves geopolitics with a heartbeat. Kaliningrad has always looked strange on a map. It is Russian land, but it does not touch mainland Russia. It sits on the Baltic Sea, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, surrounded by NATO and the European Union. For Moscow, that made it a military outpost, a forward base, a message. But for many people who actually lived there, Kaliningrad was something else entirely. It was the part of Russia that felt less Russian. People crossed borders for shopping, work, short trips, family visits, and business. They could drive into Poland, visit Lithuania, feel the speed and rhythm of Europe, and then come home the same day. Cheap flights, nearby capitals, imported goods, outside influence, different habits, different expectations. Kaliningrad was not just geographically separated from Russia. In many ways, it was mentally separated too. That is why what is happening now feels so shocking, because the catastrophe in Kaliningrad is not one single explosion. It is not one missile strike, one coup, or one sudden blackout. It is slower than that, and maybe even more frightening. It is the collapse of a whole way of life. It is the moment a region realizes that its old freedoms were never guaranteed. It is the slow turning of roads into dead ends, neighbors into borders, and strategy into suffocation. And the worst part is this. The people inside Kaliningrad can see exactly what is happening. They can feel the walls closing in, but they cannot simply step outside the trap, because the trap is the geography itself. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand what Kaliningrad used to be. This region was once Königsberg, a historic German city. After World War II, the Soviet Union took it, renamed it Kaliningrad, and transformed it into a militarized Soviet territory. Over time, the old German population was gone, and new Soviet citizens moved in. On paper, it became just another part of the USSR. But history does not disappear because a government changes a name. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Kaliningrad became an exclave. Russia still owned it, but now it was physically cut off from the rest of the country. That could have been a disaster even then. Instead, for a while, it became an opportunity. Its location made it different. Poland and Lithuania were close. Germany felt emotionally close. The Baltic coast brought visitors, trade routes mattered, European goods entered local life. Kaliningrad developed a reputation as one of the more outward-looking regions in Russia. Not fully European, not fully separate from Moscow, but clearly shaped by both worlds. That gave the region a strange identity. It was useful to the Kremlin, but it was also influenced by everything the Kremlin distrusted. That balance was fragile. Then came the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. From that moment, Kaliningrad stopped being a bridge and started becoming a pressure chamber. The region did not invade Ukraine. Ordinary people there did not choose the map they were born into, but they immediately felt the consequences. Sanctions hit Russia, borders hardened, suspicion replaced routine, insurance costs rose, transit rules tightened, the easy movement that once defined Kaliningrad began to disappear. And here is where the story becomes much darker than many people realize. Kaliningrad depends on transit. That is not a political opinion, that is a physical fact. If you want to move goods over land from mainland Russia to Kaliningrad, the route passes through Lithuania. For years, that connection mattered deeply. It was one of the arteries that kept the region supplied. In 2022, Lithuania restricted the transit of some sanctioned goods under EU rules. Moscow reacted furiously. The crisis escalated so fast that many people started talking about Kaliningrad as if it could trigger a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Later, the rules were adjusted. Rail transit for some categories continued under EU guidance, while road transit remained more restricted. Passenger and non-sanctioned goods transit continued. So this is important. Kaliningrad was not completely sealed shut. That would be an exaggeration. But the bigger reality is still serious. The old system of easy, cheap, predictable movement was broken, and when a place like Kaliningrad loses predictability, everything becomes more expensive. Businesses cannot plan the same way. Factories cannot trust delivery times. Traders cannot assume they will get what they need at the old price. Families feel it in food costs, construction costs, fuel costs, and everyday anxiety. The region has had to rely much more on sea routes from mainland Russia. Moscow expanded ferry and maritime logistics to keep supplies moving. That adaptation matters. It kept the region from immediate collapse. But adaptation is not the same thing as normal life. Moving goods by sea is slower, more complex, and often more costly than the older transit model. Russia has clearly poured effort into preventing Kaliningrad from being strangled. Sea lines between ports like Ost-Luga and Boldyansk have carried huge volumes of cargo, and Moscow has continued investing in ferries, subsidies, and logistical workarounds. That tells you something important. The Kremlin knows Kaliningrad is too strategic to abandon. But it also tells you something else. If you need emergency workarounds to keep a region functioning, then that region is already living in a state of controlled stress. And this pressure is not only economic, it is psychological. Imagine living in a place where every major regional question now sounds like a military briefing. Can goods still reach us? Can the ferries handle the load? What happens if a sanction expands? What happens if another road is disrupted? How stable is the power system? What happens in a wider NATO-Russia crisis? That is not ordinary regional life. That is permanent tension. The title of this video says people are trapped, and that word matters. Not because every road is physically blocked, not because escape is impossible, but because the choices keep shrinking. Before the war, Kaliningrad had room to breathe. It had options. Today, many of those options are gone, and the ones that remain are narrower, slower, and more political. Even its identity is under pressure. Kaliningrad was long seen as one of the most European-feeling parts of Russia. Its architecture, its memory, its location, and its habits all fed that image. Some people embraced the older history of Königsberg. Others simply liked living in a place that felt more open than much of mainland Russia. But war changes identity by changing routine. When people stop crossing borders, stop shopping abroad, stop interacting with neighbors, and stop feeling connected to the outside world, their mental map starts to close as well. That is one of the hidden catastrophes here. Isolation does not just hit cargo, it hits imagination. And once a region loses both freedom of movement and freedom of expectation, frustration starts building in silence. Now let's talk about the economy, because this is where the trap becomes brutally visible. A lot of dramatic commentary about Kaliningrad makes it sound like the region is already a dead zone. That is too simple. Reality is more complicated, and in some ways, more disturbing. Kaliningrad has not simply collapsed, it has been kept alive, supported, stabilized, managed, but the price of that survival keeps rising. That means the real question is not, has Kaliningrad fallen? The real question is, how long can Moscow keep paying to stop it from falling? Some sectors were hit hard after 2022, transit trade suffered, cross-border business suffered, foreign tourism vanished. The old model of being a Russian region with strong European economic oxygen was shattered. The automotive sector, especially the Avator plant, became a symbol of the shock. Western and Asian brands that once assembled vehicles there pulled back or vanished. Production chains broke, parts became a problem, the region had to scramble for replacements and new partners. Later, Chinese brands and new industrial arrangements helped restore some activity. Again, that matters. Kaliningrad is not frozen in one moment of disaster, it is adapting. But adaptation under sanctions does not feel like success. It feels like survival under pressure. And pressure changes the character of an economy. Instead of natural growth, you get emergency substitution. Instead of open competition, you get political rescue. Instead of stable integration with neighbors, you get dependence on subsidies, rerouted logistics, and state-backed fixes. That is why some official numbers can sound better than the mood on the ground. Moscow can point to investment projects, new transport spending, industrial recovery efforts, and continued tourism from domestic travelers. Some of that is real. Airport traffic has been strong. Russian tourists, unable or unwilling to go abroad as easily as before, have helped fill hotels and beaches. The region is not empty, but domestic tourism is not the same as being plugged into Europe. It cannot fully replace lost foreign currency, lost cross-border business culture, lost outside investment confidence, or the deeper sense that Kaliningrad was once a special window rather than a guarded balcony. And that brings us to the next shock. Energy. Because something very significant happened in 2025, and it sharpened the feeling that Kaliningrad is now living on an island in more ways than one. If this story is opening your eyes, hit the like button like an alarm switch. Subscribe before the next fault line cracks open. And share this video with someone who still thinks geography is just background. For years, the Baltic states and Russia were connected through the old Brel electricity system, a Soviet-era grid arrangement linking Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That arrangement had strategic meaning far beyond wires and engineering. It represented one of the last major infrastructure ties connecting the Baltics to the Russian system. In February 2025, the Baltic states disconnected from that Russian-linked grid and synchronized with continental Europe. For Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, this was a historic move toward energy independence and security. For the European Union, it was a geopolitical milestone. For Russia, it meant one more major tie had been cut. And for Kaliningrad, it meant something deeply symbolic. The exclave was left to operate its power system separately. Now, Russia had prepared for this. That is very important. Moscow had already invested heavily in Kaliningrad's energy resilience. New gas-fired power plants had been built. A floating storage and regasification unit had been deployed. Isolated operation tests had already been conducted. In other words, this was not some surprise that left the lights instantly going out. But even if the system holds, the message is still enormous. Kaliningrad is now more clearly on its own. That changes how people think about vulnerability. In a large grid, stability comes from scale. Problems can be absorbed more easily. In a more isolated system, every failure feels more dangerous. Even if engineers are confident, the public still understands the basic truth. Smaller islands have less room for error. And when you combine energy isolation with logistical stress, political tension, and military significance, you get a region that starts to feel like a test case for endurance. Can Kaliningrad remain livable, profitable, and calm, while its external environment becomes more hostile and its old regional model disappears? That is the real question. And if you think Moscow has a simple answer, look more closely, because the Kremlin faces a long-term contradiction in Kaliningrad. It needs the territory for prestige, military posture, and symbolism. Losing control is unthinkable. Letting the region visibly fail would be humiliating. But keeping Kaliningrad stable now requires real money, real logistics, real subsidies, real planning, and constant political attention at a time when Russia is already under enormous strain from war, sanctions, and military spending. So Kaliningrad becomes both priceless and costly. Too important to lose, too burdensome to treat like normal. That is how traps form at the state level. And that state-level trap creates a human-level trap. Because what do ordinary people do in a place like this? Some stay and adapt. Some work in sectors boosted by state spending. Some benefit from tourism. Some convince themselves the worst is over. And to be fair, life in Kaliningrad has not ended. Shops still exist. Flights still come in. Beaches still attract visitors. Children still go to school. People still fall in love, go to work, and make plans. That is exactly why this story is so powerful. Catastrophe does not always look like ruins. Sometimes it looks like normal life with a permanent tremor underneath it. A region that still functions, but no longer feels secure. A city that still breathes, but more shallowly than before. A population that can continue living day to day, while quietly understanding that the ground under their future has shifted. This is where we need to talk about fear, not panic. Fear. Panic is loud, fear is organized. Fear changes habits. It changes savings, career choices, travel plans, family decisions, and the stories parents tell their children about the future. If you are young in Kaliningrad, what do you believe now? Do you believe your region will become more connected or more sealed? Do you believe opportunities will widen or narrow? Do you believe your city is a platform or a pocket? Do you believe you are living in a gateway or in a fortress that could one day become a burden even to the power that built it? Those questions matter because they shape who stays and who leaves. There are conflicting narratives about migration and labor in Kaliningrad. Some outside commentary paints a picture of mass collapse and unstoppable flight. More recent data suggests something more mixed. Federal support, labor shortages across Russia, military-related demand, and domestic tourism have all helped tighten the labor market rather than empty it overnight. Official sources and recent analysis point to low unemployment and rising wages in parts of the economy. So no, the clean story of total abandonment does not hold up. But that does not mean the danger is fake. A place can have jobs and still feel trapped. A place can have wage growth and still lose confidence. A place can be economically supported and still become strategically brittle. That is what makes Kaliningrad so fascinating and so unsettling at the same time. It is not dying in one dramatic blow. It is being transformed into a more dependent, more militarized, more managed version of itself. And that transformation may be irreversible for years. Think about what has been lost. Not just trade routes, not just easy crossings, not just foreign tourists, not just supply chains. What has been lost is the feeling that Kaliningrad could keep drifting toward a more open identity while still remaining under Russian sovereignty. That experiment has been crushed. Now the region is being pulled in the opposite direction. More dependence on Moscow, more reliance on state rescue, more strategic anxiety, more separation from the neighborhood that once helped define it. And once that process goes far enough, the damage is not only economic, it becomes civilizational. Kaliningrad stops asking, how do we benefit from being between worlds? And starts asking, how do we survive being cut off inside one? That is a tragic downgrade. It is also why the word trapped feels emotionally true even when it is not literally absolute. People are trapped by uncertainty, trapped by geography, trapped by political decisions made far away, trapped by the fact that their region matters too much to be left alone but not enough for their preferences to shape its future. And if a bigger crisis ever comes in the Baltic, Kaliningrad could become one of the most dangerous pressure points on the continent. Think about that for a second. This tiny strip of Russian territory is not just a place where people go to the beach or visit old Prussian sites. It is also packed with strategic meaning. Missiles, military assets, NATO planning, the Suwalki Gap, alliance fears, Russian signaling, and European counterplanning all swirl around it. So the civilians living there carry a double burden. They live in a region that is economically harder to maintain and militarily impossible to ignore. That is a terrible combination. Because when great powers look at a map, they see leverage. When ordinary people look at the same map, they see vulnerability. If this breakdown feels more real than the headlines, subscribe now. Drop a comment with the next geopolitical pressure point you want covered, and share this with the person who always says, that place is too small to matter. Here's the brutal irony. Kaliningrad was supposed to prove Russia could plant power deep in Europe. Instead, it is increasingly proving how expensive isolated power can become. For decades, the region symbolized reach. Russia's Western fist, its unsinkable Baltic outpost, its way of reminding Europe that Moscow was still present, still armed, still close. But in a more connected era, Kaliningrad also developed another meaning. It showed that borders could soften, that trade could calm old history, that proximity could slowly reshape identity. Now both of those meanings are colliding. The military value remains. The civilian openness has been smashed. And when those two forces collide, the people living there pay the price. The ports matter more. The ferries matter more. The power plants matter more. The military logic matters more. But everyday freedom matters less. That trade-off is the catastrophe. Not one dramatic event, not one cinematic ending. A whole region slowly reorganized around survival. And here is where many analysts make a mistake. They ask whether Kaliningrad can be supplied, whether it can keep functioning, whether Moscow can keep the system stable. Those are valid questions, but they are not the deepest questions. The deepest question is this: what kind of life is being preserved there? Because a government can subsidize transport, it can reroute cargo, it can build ferries, it can install turbines, it can pour in money, it can issue confident statements. But can it restore what made Kaliningrad feel open? Can it bring back trust with neighbors while the war continues? Can it recreate the psychological freedom of living beside Europe rather than against it? Can it replace the lost sense of possibility that came from being a frontier of exchange rather than a frontier of confrontation? That is much harder, maybe impossible under current conditions, and that is why what happened in 2025 matters so much. The Baltic grid split was not just a technical event, it was a symbol. Another cable cut in the mind of the region. Another reminder that Kaliningrad's old world is not coming back soon. The roads still exist, but they feel narrower. The sea still connects, but at a price. The lights still stay on, but under a different kind of tension. The hotels may still fill, but with a different type of visitor. The factories may still run, but through substituted parts and political support. Everything continues, but not in the same spirit. And human beings feel that difference even when statistics try to hide it. You can measure cargo, you can count passengers, you can compare inflation, you can report wages. But it is much harder to measure the death of a regional mood, the slow disappearance of confidence, the sense that a place once moving outward is now folding inward, the quiet understanding that your home has become a geopolitical hostage to decisions you cannot influence. That is what makes Kaliningrad such a haunting story. It is a warning about what happens when geography, war, and identity all collide in one narrow strip of land. And it is not only a Russian story, it is a European story too. Because Europe once hoped that trade and interdependence could soften hard power. Kaliningrad looked, for a time, like proof of that idea. A strange territory, yes, but also a workable one. A militarized history slowly diluted by everyday contact and mutual benefit. Now that hope looks badly damaged. The enclaves of the future may not be bridges, they may be fault lines. So are people in Kaliningrad truly trapped? Physically, not in the absolute sense. Planes still fly, ferries still move, rail transit still exists under conditions. Life goes on. But strategically, psychologically, and historically, yes, they are trapped inside a region whose importance has become its prison. Trapped between the military value Moscow cannot surrender and the openness Moscow can no longer provide. Trapped between the memory of a freer past and the mechanics of a harder future. Trapped between the sea routes that keep the shelves stocked and the political storms that could make every shipment feel uncertain. And maybe most of all, trapped by the fact that Kaliningrad is now being forced to answer a question it was never meant to answer so brutally. What happens to a place built as an outpost when the outside world closes in? We are watching the answer in real time. Kaliningrad is not disappearing. It is hardening. And for the people inside, that may be the most catastrophic outcome of all. Because a city can survive and still lose the best version of itself. A region can remain supplied and still feel cut off. A map can stay the same while life inside it changes completely. That is the real disaster in Kaliningrad. Not that the territory vanished, but that the promise it once held has. If this story stayed with you, don't just leave quietly like the video, subscribe for the next deep dive, and share it with one person who needs to understand that the most dangerous collapses are often the slowest ones.